Chicago is known for industry, stockyards, steel mills, and more, but this city had another that thrived for nearly 150 years. Today we're talking about the rise and fall of Chicago's brickyards. I'm Tommy Henry, and this is the Chicago History Podcast. If you look at many older neighborhood homes and buildings in Chicago, you'll see the bricks used on the front of those structures are different from the ones on the sides and back. The attractive face brick, the ones facing the street, are often a deep red color, a light, smoother brick, or a variety of other styles. The ones on the side and back are rougher, some would say ugly, and more utilitarian. Those side bricks, those were likely made here in the greatest city in the world. Chicago, mid-1800s. Back then, most buildings were made of wood. It was inexpensive, plentiful, and workers could construct new homes quickly. Lumber could be brought down from Wisconsin and Michigan via boats, offloaded, and quickly put to use in this developing metropolis. That same lumber was also utilized in the early to mid-19th century to make sidewalks and streets. Nearly 50 miles of Chicago's roadways were made of wood blocks called Nicholson pavement. According to the Encyclopedia of Chicago, in 1840 there were fewer than 1,000 structures in the Chicago area. This figure passed 10,000 around 1854, with many of them made primarily of wood. Now, if you're thinking, didn't anyone see a potential catastrophe looming? Well, yes, they did. Kind of. As early as 1833, the city enacted rules for construction, many of which were designed to prevent fires. The first fire ordinance, passed in November of 1833, prohibited, quote, the passing of any stovepipe through the roof, partition, or siding of any building, unless guarded by tin or iron 6 inches from the wood. This ordinance aimed to reduce the risk of fires caused by improperly installed stovepipes, a common cause of building fires at the time. Violators faced a $5 fine, which could be repeated every 48 hours if the violation was not corrected. $5 is roughly $191 in today's value. 1833 was the same year that a 1.5-story brick house measuring 20 foot square was erected in Chicago, built by Detroit native Tyler K. Blodgett. This brick house was located on the south side of the Chicago River opposite the brickyard Blodgett ran with Henry S. Lampman along the north side of the river between Dearborn and Clark Streets. Blodgett's Brickyard is considered the first brick plant in Chicago, and Henry Lampman is credited as the first brick maker in the city. In 1881, the Chicago Tribune ran a column called "The Man Who Made Bricks for the First Brick Building Erected Here, His Reminiscences of a Sojourn Here in 1833. In it, brickmaker Henry Lampman shared his story and how he ended up in Chicago. Born in 1810 in Greenville, New York, roughly 140 miles north of New York City, Lampman left home at 21 to seek his fortune at the west end of the Erie Canal. Arriving in Buffalo, he fell in with a group headed to Detroit and joined them. Not long after arriving in Detroit, Lampman became restless once again and set out on foot for Kalamazoo County, roughly 140 miles west of Detroit. On foot! After spending the winter there, he circled back east, stopping in Washtenaw County, approximately 30 miles west of Detroit, where he was put to work making bricks for the summer. In the spring of 1833, Lampman met an agent for a man named Nobles, who was looking to start a brickyard in Chicago. Lampman agreed to go to work for the upstart company, and on the 20th of March set out, once again on foot, for Chicago, nearly 240 miles west. For most of his trip, Lampman traveled along the roads as best he could and would construct his own crafts to cross streams. When he finally reached LaPorte, Indiana, he spent his remaining journey walking along the beach at Lake Michigan heading north to Chicago. Arriving in the city, Lampman found 3 wood frame houses, 3 places where goods were sold, and a number of log houses occupied by French traders. Lampman also discovered that Nobles had changed his mind about opening a brickyard, but that Tyler Blodgett had planned to open one and would hire Lampman on. Blodgett had considered opening his own brickyard for some time, but when he found out another brickyard was already in the works, he bowed out, believing the small town could not support 2 brickyards. With Nobles out of the way, Blodgett, with the help of Henry Lampman, pressed forward, assembling a crew of 20. That first brick dwelling constructed by Lampman and his men was significant as it marked the beginning of brick construction in Chicago. Once the first house was built, Blodgett and Lampman used their hand molds to continue making bricks, ones they used to build the Blodgett residence at State and Adams, now the site of a Starbucks. So, what was it about Chicago that made people think it would be a good place to make bricks?
It all really comes down to glaciers.
That voice belongs to Will Quam, an architecture photographer, architecture writer, and researcher with a love of bricks. It would be foolish of me to try to tell the story of Chicago's brickyards without his help. Back to Will.
14,000 years ago, Chicago was covered in this enormous glacial lake, Lake Chicago. And it extended all the way out its shores to areas like Naperville. And this glacial lake was full of stuff that the glaciers had carved up across Wisconsin and Canada and all over the country. And suddenly when you have all this still water as the glacier slowly recedes, that still water is perfect for all the smallest particulate to settle out onto the lake bed. And that finest particulate is clay and sand and silt. And slowly then, as that lake receded into what's now Lake Michigan, the clay all remained. And it remained right at the surface of the ground. And the great thing about that mixture of clay is it was a really perfect mixture for making bricks. It's not a guarantee that any old clay you find is going to make a good brick clay. Sometimes you have to add in binders or, play with it to get it to the right consistency, right plasticity. But that Chicago clay was perfect for making bricks. Terrible for making skyscrapers, but perfect for making bricks.
And that clay, so perfect for making bricks, created the one for which Chicago became known, the Chicago Common Brick. Once dug up, workers manually mixed the clay, sometimes with their feet or with simple tools, to remove lumps, large stones, and debris to ensure uniform texture. The clay would then be packed into wood molds and left to dry. Once dry, they were then stacked and placed into large sheds containing kilns, where the bricks were fired for 60 hours or so at temperatures ranging between 1,500 and 2,000 degrees. When fired in a kiln, that bluish clay, found 18 to 24 inches below the topsoil in Chicago, produced 2¼ by 3 3/4 by 8-inch bricks weighing roughly 4 pounds in colors from a pinkish salmon to shades of yellow. They may not be the prettiest brick, but they got the job done. The process of hand molding and kiln firing bricks was not only physically demanding, but also seasonal, as bricks could not be made when nights were freezing. Production was largely limited to the warmer months, typically May through November. By the 1850s, construction of new wooden structures was banned from the central business district of the city. Of course, because Chicago, existing wood structures were grandfathered in. New construction would need to be made of something other than wood, but the wood buildings already in place should be fine, right? Now, the idea that Chicago was a wood town that grudgingly switched to brick isn't exactly true. As early as the mid-1850s, there were more than 20 large brickyards in the Chicago area, which transformed clay from pits into approximately 100 million bricks per year. The use of brick-making machines, introduced to Chicago in 1856 by M. O. Walker, allowed the output of individual yards to increase significantly. The brickyard of Strauss, Hahn and Company in Blue Island, south of Chicago, and established in 1863, was producing over 25 million bricks per year by the early 1870s. Before Chicago would be transformed from a city of wood to a city of brick, there needed to be a big event, and that event was the Great Chicago Fire. On October 8, 1871, a fire broke out southwest of Chicago's center. The blaze quickly spread through the predominantly wooden city, and over the next 30 hours, the conflagration consumed approximately 3.3 square miles of central Chicago, leaving more than 100,000 people, one-third of the city, homeless, and claiming about 300 lives. The Great Chicago Fire effectively destroyed the heart of the growing metropolis, leaving it in smoldering ruins. During the Great Chicago Fire of 1871, approximately 17,450 buildings were destroyed, with nearly two-thirds of those lost made of wood. In the North Division alone, out of 13,800 buildings, only about 500 remained standing, indicating that over 13,000 wooden buildings were lost in that area, with similar devastation in other parts of the city. No stone ever used in the business part of the city is worth a farthing in such a fire, one onlooker was quoted as saying in the 1871 book, The Great Conflagration, Chicago, Its Past, Present, and Future. Brick is the only thing that comes out whole and is ready to try it again. The future Chicago will be a city of bricks. Near the end of the terrible fire's rampage, people began to return to Dearborn Street, where a man was observed closely examining the bricks of a ruined building, picking them up and running his fingers along the surface. When asked what he was doing, his response was, "I was just seeing if they were cool enough to build with again." Roughly 5 weeks later, on November 16, 1871, the Common Council's Special Committee, considering new fire safety regulations, proposed a ban on wooden houses as well as very high standards for those made of brick. By the terms of this proposal, walls of one-story brick houses must be at least 12 inches thick, and taller homes must have even thicker walls in their lower stories. All roofs were to be made of metal, slate, terracotta, or another fireproof material, and any cornices, coping, bay windows, or other projections must be similarly non-flammable. The proposal immediately drew criticism, not only from working-class residents who could not afford such buildings, but also from those in the real estate business who claimed it would drive up prices. The fire limits allowed much of the area on the north side of the city to use wood, a great help to those of limited means. Even with the new rules in place, according to author Michael Konzen in the Encyclopedia of Chicago, many replacement buildings across the city continued to be built of wood, making the fire limits a hollow act of city governance.
After the Great Fire of 1871, Chicago almost became a brick-making boom town. People from all over the country who had experience in brickmaking, who didn't have experience in brickmaking, rushed here to try to make their fortune making bricks to rebuild the city. And so these pits of clay making bricks opened all over the city, some of them fruitful, many of them not. And slowly the successful ones started to produce, the unsuccessful ones faded away. But there were a ton of brickmaking companies across Cook County, across the Chicago area.
Fewer than 3 years later, in July 1874, another significant fire struck the city, though smaller in scale than the 1871 conflagration. While less devastating, the Second Chicago Fire destroyed 812 structures. Of these, 619 were wood-frame buildings, including one 4-story frame, 21 3-story frame, 471 2-story frame, and 126 one-story frame structures. The remainder were primarily brick or stone buildings. After this second fire, many insurance companies based in New York City refused to grant any new policies for construction in Chicago. until the city changed its building codes to prevent another catastrophe. The companies even launched campaigns encouraging businesses to leave Chicago, creating, as one writer called it, an existential crisis for the city. In 1881, Chicago was home to 68 brickyards, all pressing Chicago common brick, sometimes referred to as Chicago pinks, owing to their appearance. In 1870, the average brick company manufactured 40,000 bricks in a 10-hour day. Improved machinery helped double this output by the 1893 World's Fair, and by 1900, Chicago brickyards were producing 1.6 million bricks per day, roughly 600 million per year. Earlier I mentioned face bricks, those aesthetically pleasing bricks builders put on the fronts of buildings, relegating the Chicago common bricks to the sides and back. As Chicago only produced common bricks, face bricks had to be brought in from other parts of the country where the clay had different properties and produced better-looking bricks. St. Louis, Pennsylvania, Indiana, Ohio, Milwaukee, Michigan, and Mississippi were major sources of face bricks for Chicago and the Midwest. Each of those regions' bricks had distinctive colors and finishes. Deep reds from St. Louis, owing to the high levels of iron oxide in their clay. Buff and cream bricks from Indiana and Milwaukee, thanks to local clay with high levels of calcium and magnesium. And smooth reds or buffs from Pennsylvania and Ohio. Fun fact I learned from Will Quam, the Milwaukee Bucks NBA basketball team occasionally wears uniforms emblazoned with the words Cream City. Most people likely associate this term with Wisconsin's identity as America's Dairyland. However, the term actually refers to the creamy yellow color of the locally produced bricks. One other huge factor in using common bricks for most of the construction and face bricks for the front, cost. Back in the day, Chicago common brick cost about $5 to $10 per thousand bricks, compared to as much as $35 per thousand for those pretty face bricks. Brick Guy Will mentioned the numerous brickmaking operations around Chicago that popped up after the fire. Here are just a few. One Chicago area with many, many brickmaking operations and clay pits was known as Bricktown, along the north branch of the Chicago River, about where Roscoe Village and North Center are today. In the 1870s and 1880s, the area was mostly unsettled and unused, farmed by German settlers. This undeveloped land became an ideal spot to dig clay, and so the area between Western Avenue and the Chicago River around Warner Avenue, I'll get back to that in a bit, became home to no fewer than 8 brickyards by 1894. There were brickyards from Pratt to Howard along the north branch of the Chicago River well into the 20th century. It is hard to imagine the area bounded by Diversey to the south, Ashland Avenue to the east, Wellington to the north, and the train tracks to the west, currently the site of a retail strip mall, houses, and a park, was where 4 clay pits were once active. The 1894 Sanborn fire map shows the Fred Zappel Brickyard operating in the northeast portion, the William Miller Brick Company in the southeast corner, L. Werheim and Son Brickyard to the northwest at Wellington and the tracks, and a 4th clay pit in the southwest corner near the Illinois Malleable Iron Company. Just across the street, on the east side of Ashland, between Diversey and Wellington, were 4 more brickyards sharing 3 large clay pits. On the southwest side, on the southeast corner of Archer and California, was the Murphy and Lorimar Brickyard in 1897, and later the Alonzo Curtis Brick Company in 1910. South of the Loop, J.M.L. Sexton's Brickyard was situated on the south side of present-day Pershing Road, still called 39th Street then, and Levitt, which was located about 900 feet from the Chicago Brick Company. At 43rd Street and present-day Damon, then called Roby, Haight and Allsip's brickyard could be found not far from the J.B. Legnard Steam Brickyard and the John Bussey Brickyard. For those of you in the suburbs, you may not realize there likely were brickyards operating near where you live now. A farm near present-day Lake Cook and Waukegan Roads in north suburban Northbrook, Illinois, was found to have excellent clay soil, and so the National Brick Company and one other brick company began operations in the area after the Great Chicago Fire. If you listen to the episode about forgotten towns, neighborhoods, and names, you may recall that a town approximately 19 miles northwest of downtown Chicago was originally named Pennyville, after George Penny, a businessman who owned a local brickyard. Perhaps to draw more attention to his business, in the mid-1850s, Penny requested the village's name be changed to Brickton. By the 1870s, when most of the brick-making in the area had dried up, the townsfolk felt the area needed a classier name, and Park Ridge was chosen. Glenview, just 22 miles northwest of downtown Chicago, had the Lutter Brick and Tile Company, which was started by Henry Lutter in 1905 and operated until 1948 on 150 acres of land on the northeast corner of Chestnut by the railroad. While the company was headquartered in Chicago at 1445 Diversey Parkway, the brickyard itself was indeed in Glenview and was one of the biggest employers in the area, manufacturing 50 million bricks per year. Shortly after the Great Chicago Fire of 1871, Philadelphia-born William L. Gregg arrived in the Chicago suburb now called Westmont. Gregg bought 80 acres of land that was being used as a farm and a dairy just south of the railroad depot, at which time the area became known as Gregg's Milk Station. Digging up clay at a depth of 60 feet for his Excelsior Brick Company, Gregg chose one of the highest points along the Chicago, Burling, and Quincy Railroad to make it slightly easier for trains to bring their load of bricks to Chicago. Gregg also built his home using bricks from his own factory. By 1872, he had the capacity to produce 70,000 bricks a day using 2 brick presses and employed as many as 120 workers. During his time in the Chicago area, Gregg invented and patented a triple-pressure brick machine, which created bricks that could withstand 100,000 pounds of pressure without cracking. More on William Gregg in a bit. The brick manufacturing process continued to be improved greatly throughout the 1880s. Brick manufacturer W. H. Allsip noted in 1891 that, quote, more had been done during the past 25 years than in all the preceding ages, end quote, to improve the methods and resulting quality of brickmaking. If that brickmaker's name perked up the ears of listeners from Chicago's southwest suburbs, the village of Allsip, Illinois, was indeed named for Frank Allsip, who founded the Allsip Brick Company in 1885. At 123rd Street was the Weckler Prussing Brick Company, separated from the Wall Brothers Steam Brickworks by a set of train tracks. In 1897, Wall Brothers Steam Brickworks had the capacity to produce 300,000 bricks in just 10 hours. Dalton, Illinois, south of Chicago, and home to the United States' first pope, saw their first brickyard open in 1885, and eventually the city had 3 brick factories. Companies in Blue Island, roughly 16 miles south of the Loop, got into the brickmaking game as early as 1852, when the Haberer Brickyard began operating near York Street and the train tracks, still known as the Grand Trunk Railroad then. Roughly 3 years later, Henry Wibben opened a brickyard on the banks of the Calumet River close to 135th Street. A man named Carl Rusno had a small brickmaking operation on the south side of Vermont Street, west of Ashland Avenue, also close to the Calumet River. And John Slate operated a small yard near Rusno's. These were early small-scale yards that did not use brick machines. The clay was tempered in circular pits by large wheels that were drawn by horses. Once the clay was ready, it was packed by hand into wooden molds, with each mold holding 6 bricks. The Haber Brickyard ran for several years, closing after the death of the owner, and the Wibben Yard ran for 8 or 10 years with 2 different owners. Blue Island was later home to 4 large brickyards, which by the early 1930s were manufacturing a combined 1.5 million bricks a day. The Illinois Brick Company's location in Blue Island, called the largest brickyard in the world, covered 150 acres and had a capacity of 600,000 per day. So proud of their brickmaking abilities, in 1931 the city of Blue Island announced plans to advertise their 2.5 mile long business district by building arched gateways to highlight this, with one gateway at the north entrance at 119th and Western, and one at 139th and Western at the southern edge. Because Blue Island is the largest brick city in the world, then Mayor Frank Caston said, the archways would be made of brick. Plans call for a tower on either side of the arch. These would be lighted at night, and the sign, Blue Island, largest brick city in the world, would appear on the archways. Another brickyard of the South was Tuttle's Brick Factory at 138th and Halsted, which opened in 1892 and had a long and prosperous run in that area. 1.5 miles east of Blue Island and 1.5 miles west of Riverdale was another Haight and Alsip brickyard, which according to the 1897 Sanborn Fire Insurance map had a capacity of 30,000 bricks per hour. The front page of the May 7th, 1895 Chicago Tribune carried a story about women and young children working at brickyards. When the Trade and Labor Assembly visited the brickyards, owners claimed that while women did work there, they did not dig clay or make the bricks. Instead, they were responsible for hacking the bricks, which consisted of them turning the bricks over and piling them in rows. As many fans of Chicago history know, the city has been pivotal in labor uprisings, from the Chicago Railroad strike of 1877 to the Haymarket Affair in 1886 to the Pullman strike in 1894. Brickworkers were also involved in strikes of their own. Sure, workers won the right to an 8-hour workday, but many employers insisted on paying brickworkers on a per-piece basis, not an hourly wage. For brickmakers, this could result in lesser quality bricks being produced. For bricklayers, rush jobs could mean inferior buildings being constructed. 1895 saw a significant strike by brickworkers when on May 21st and 22nd of that year, every union brickmaker in Chicago stopped working, refusing to make or move any bricks until their wage issues were addressed. The larger brick manufacturers, representing 7/8 of all national output, were in favor of a wage scale demanded by the workmen and sided with them against 20 smaller non-union brick firms on the north side who had refused to join the union or pay the equivalent of union scale. A spokesman for the Brickmakers Association claimed that unless the strike was settled within a few weeks, all building trades would be affected and 50,000 to 100,000 workers would lose their jobs. It took nearly 3 months for that strike to be settled. By the late 19th century, Chicago building trade unions had become highly influential, controlling work rules, apprenticeship systems, and the pace of construction. Through the Building Trades Council, unions enforced exclusive agreements with contractors and were able to call sympathy strikes, effectively shutting down construction sites if any union's demands were not met. While these practices may have given unions significant leverage, they also led to rising construction costs and unpredictability for contractors. In 1900, Chicago was the epicenter of a major and protracted labor conflict in the construction industry, known as the Chicago Building Trades Conflict of 1900. This struggle was one of the most significant labor disputes of its era, reflecting deep tensions within powerful building trade unions and increasingly organized contractors. On March 6, 1900, 59 material firms agreed to close their plants due to these labor troubles, suspending all operations until issues could be settled. The result of this action put 10,000 men out of work and tied up roughly $20 million, nearly $750 million today, in capital invested in various projects. In addition to the 10,000 tradesmen now unemployed, this shutdown put hundreds of clerks and bookkeepers out of work. Without the brick plants in operation, the railroads that utilize rail cars to transport materials to nearby towns would lay idle. Without the demand for fuel for kilns, coal dealers saw their business suffer as well. After months of deadlock, the unions ultimately suffered a significant defeat. The contractors' united front held, and the unions were forced to accept the contractors' terms. The most restrictive union practices, such as exclusive agreements and the widespread use of sympathy strikes, were abolished.
As we get towards the 20th century, a lot of that easy-to-access clay starts to get used up. They start wanting to go for larger and larger pits. It stops being as economical to have just a small operation. And a lot of these small companies start to form together into the newly formed Illinois Brick Company. It's sort of this conglomeration. I think of it almost as, the Facebook of its day, buying up all these other smaller companies to bring them all under one operation. Some of them, they kept running. Some of them, they shut down and just pulled everything into these really large pits and really large operations.
On March 31st, 1936 brick manufacturers formally reorganized under a new corporation, Illinois Brick Company, increasing its capital stock to $9 million, nearly $345 million today. The Illinois Brick Company quickly absorbed the equipment and operations of 31 major concerns, including well-known names like Frank Alsip, Shermerville Brick Company, Evanston Brick Company, Little Brothers, Jefferson Brick Company, and many others. Additionally, the company bought the equipment of 5 more companies operating in the city at that time, bringing nearly all the important brick-making interests in Cook County under its control. This move represented the amalgamation of nearly all of the most significant brick-making interests in Cook County, aiming to stabilize the market and protect the interests of the remaining manufacturers. According to D.V. Purrington, one of the promoters of the new company, quote, "By the formation of this company, a great saving can be effected. The yard that will have been making poor quality brick will be closed. In this way, we will secure a uniformity of quality, size, and price. The price will be fixed at about $6.50 a thousand. It has been as high as $12, and of late years as low as $3.75, which is less than cost. We will not fight the other brick companies." The Illinois Brick Company subsequently acquired additional brickyards in the following years, further consolidating the industry. You'd think that after all the years of brick making and all the bricks that had already been produced, things would slow down by now. You'd be wrong. In 1910 alone, brick factories in the city and suburbs produced nearly 1 billion bricks. Proving that every interest has a trade publication or magazine to support it, the following is from the January 1910 edition of Brick, the leading clay journal. Nowhere else in the country are common brick manufactured with such rapidity as at the various yards in the vicinity of Chicago. The quick-burning qualities of the Chicago clays and the modern equipment and economical handling of the product make it possible to produce common brick at these plants at less cost than anywhere else in the country. By 1915, 10% of all brick made in America was made right here in Chicago. Chicago reached the peak of its brick production between 1910 and the 1920s, when annual output remained extremely high, with estimates ranging from 685 million to nearly 700 million Chicago common bricks per year. Here's Will Quam.
So So in 1933, a massive brick conspiracy in Chicago is shut down by a federal antitrust lawsuit. It begins, though, in 1909 with a guy named R.C. Penfield. Penfield himself did not actually make any bricks, but what he did make was even more important. He made a machine that could stack bricks. This was a time in 1909 where if you wanted to stack 300,000 bricks, you need 36 skilled men paid $300 a day. That's a lot of money. Penfield develops a machine that can pick up these unfired bricks, stack them into these clear piles that can be then burned, that replaces those 36 highly paid men with only 12 unskilled men being paid just $83 a day. So suddenly things get so much cheaper. And when you're dealing with a material like common brick, price is all important. What Penfield then does, knowing how valuable this machine is instead of just selling the machine to brick manufacturers, he sells them a license to the machine. So they buy a license to the machine. And as they buy the license to the machine, he then sets a quota of how much of the brick in Chicago each firm can produce. And each firm set by Penfield can only produce up to that amount. They also have to agree to price caps that he was setting. For example, Illinois Brick could produce up to 52% of all the common brick in Chicago in any given year. The smallest, Calumet Brick Company, can only produce 2.6%. If you went over your percentage, you have to then pay penalty that would be spread out to everybody else. Problem comes when the Illinois Brick Company starts to realize that they can make more money by just collecting penalties than actually making bricks and selling bricks. So they start to buy up some of the smaller companies, but then they also start to just shut down some of their plants, make them dormant, because they, by the 1920s, are allowed to produce 60+% of all the brick in Chicago. And if they pull back their production, everybody else stays the same. Suddenly everybody else's percentages go way up and they have to pay penalties. And the Illinois Brick Company gets a bunch of money without having to do anything. And it worked that way for a really long time until a guy started the Tuthill Material Company, bought the Penfield machine, and then stopped paying the license. Stopped paying the license, said, I'm still going to use the machine. I'm not going to follow your quotas. And it was actually Penfield who then sued him in court to try to enforce the license. That then led to Judge Johnson of the Northern District Court of Illinois to call it a brick cabal that was, quote, livered in legal form. But its history and practice sheds a light which shows the parties naked before the law, and they may be seen as they actually exist, working in a conspiracy in restraint of trade to control prices. And broke it up and said, hey, you can't do this. You're destroying free trade. And the Illinois Brick Company had made over $700,000 in just 8 years, not making any bricks. And so the whole thing was broken up. Prices went back to market prices, which were not that much more than the prices that were being set, but the market was allowed to decide once again. But it's a great example of how important labor was to the making of these bricks, but also how important it was for the companies to try to get rid of labor. Because labor was cost, and they wanted to have the cheapest product available.
While behind the scenes in the 1930s, brickmakers were experiencing legal upheavals, on the streets, the Chicago Common Brick was getting some love when famed architecture firm Keck & Keck began using Chicago Common Brick on the fronts of buildings. Now, we've talked about strikes, consolidations of operations, brick cabals, and more, so I bet you're wondering, what brought about the decline of the brick industry here in Chicago?
So the decline of common brick in Chicago was really kind of this perfect storm of factors. The first is just cost. After the end of the Second World War, labor costs are what rise and rise and rise, and material costs don't actually change that much. And so the way to save money then on a wall in terms of material is to just use a larger unit. A larger unit just doesn't take as much time to lay. That's how you get concrete block entering the market in a huge way, cinder block. You don't need to buy as many. It just doesn't take as much time. And by the 1950s, you can build a wall for about a third of the price, parts and labor, out of concrete block than you can common brick.
A 1952 Chicago Tribune article broke down the pricing difference as such. to erect a wall 8 inches thick, accounting for material, labor, and the contractor's overhead and profit, 1,000 Chicago common brick would be needed to make up a wall 77 square feet in area. This would cost the building owner $120 installed. To build the same wall area using concrete blocks, only 87 of the 8 by 8 by 16 inch pieces would be needed and would cost the owner $43.50 installed. Back to Will.
And so people just start buying less and less and less common brick. And the plants start to shut down. By 1953, there are 7 left. By 1963, there were just 4. One of them then burned down. The Brick Company in Stickney, their whole operation burned down accidentally, and it just was too expensive to restart, and they shut down. Another one quietly shuttered, became a dump. What really brought everything finally down was environmental regulations, which I like to always make a point to remind us are very, very good. By 1968, there were just 2 manufacturers left in Chicago. The American Brick Company, which was a new conglomerate, and the Illinois Brick Company, that old conglomerate. But in 1970, the Clean Air Act is passed. The EPA is formed. And brick companies all over the country are told, hey, you have to get your emissions under control. They're releasing such great amounts of sulfur dioxide and ozone and just soot and smog into the air. In Munster, Indiana, where the American Brick Company had one of their plants, there are certain intersections near the plant you just couldn't drive on when they were firing because the smoke was just so thick. And so they're told, you need to clean up or you need to shut down. The Illinois Brick Company at this point in Blue Island basically just takes a look at how much clay they have left. They've been mining clay there for little over 60 years. And they realize we've got maybe 5 years left. What we do have is a lot of land that we can sell. So in 1974, they decide we're going to sell this land. They sell it off. They shut down. They sell the name to a material supply firm and lived on for a while in that way. But that left just the American Brick Company. The American Brick Company is interesting because it had been operated by the Carey family for almost 100 years by that point. And at this point, it was the grandson of the founder of the company running it. And he really, really wanted to keep this operation open and keep the employees in work and just keep common brick alive. And so he hired scientists to do experiments, to do tests. And basically what they found was they would need to build these big stainless steel hoods over the brick firing area because these common bricks were fired almost in open air bonfires. You can kind of think of a little less messy, but very messy. And if they did that, they would make, negative money. He even went so far as he went to Washington, D.C. and met with then Vice President George H.W. Bush to try to argue that they were only over the limit of their exhaust for a fraction of the time, a portion of the 2-3 day firing, and that it evened out enough over the course that they were below the limit. But it just didn't work. It didn't work. And the company was forced to then shut down after getting fines of up to $5,000 a day from the EPA, from the Illinois Department of the Environment. And in 1981, their last plant in Dalton shut down. And that was the end. That was the end of common brick being produced in Chicago, but also in the entire United States. The American brick plant in Dalton was the last one ever.
So, what happened to the land once occupied by brick factories and these often massive clay pits? If you know the area on the south side of Irving Park Road, west of Western, between Campbell and Rockwell, you might be surprised to know that in 1898, a brick factory operated on the 9-acre property there. In a little more than a decade, however, the site's clay pits were being used as a city dump. By 1917, River Park Commissioner John J. O'Shea began to push for a park on the site, and the River Park District acquired the property in 1921. Improvements began the following year. The Brickyard owner's original cottage on the site was remodeled as a field house, By 1928, Jacob L. Crane Jr., a landscape architect and an early River Park board member, had prepared detailed plans for what would become Paul Revere Park. The Chicago Landscape Company executed a modified version of Crane's plans that included an athletic field and tennis courts set in a green landscape of trees and curving paths. Chicago architect Clarence Hatzfeld designed a slate-roofed brick field house dedicated in 1931. Former clay pits being used as dumps came up a lot in my research. Various brick companies had operated for years on the land in Chicago's 40th Ward, bounded by Montrose, California, Irving Park, and the North Shore Channel. One brick company at that 54-acre site mined clay from a pit that eventually covered 35 acres, extending 45 feet deep. Of course, once the clay supply had been exhausted, you guessed it, the company skedaddled, leaving the open pits uncovered, which quickly became used as a dumping site. Local residents were not amused and began an 11-year battle to get the site closed. By 1947, it was estimated that 280,000 loads of garbage and refuse had been dumped in the area. In August of that year, it was announced that the city had taken over the land with plans to build a park. The new park, on which work may begin next spring, then 40th Ward Alderman Benjamin Becker said, will be one of the largest and finest of the proposed new parks in Chicago. The area, instead of creating a stench, eyesore, breeding ground for mosquitoes, flies, and rats, will enhance the high residential standard of surrounding areas and will provide a much-needed playground site for thousands of adults and children. In 1949, the Park District began demolishing the remaining brick kilns and industrial structures, and soon the Henry Horner Park, named for Illinois' first Jewish governor, was opened. Letter Brick in Glenview stopped production in the mid-1940s and leased the land to the Metropolitan Disposal Company, which used the clay pit for their dump site. Neighbors were not thrilled. After 14 years and a prolonged court battle, it was finally closed on April 11, 1962. The Lutter Company offered to construct a garbage incinerator on the land it owned 1 mile north of Glenview that would serve 265,000 north and northwest area residents with a system that would meet all county, state, and federal specifications. But after a decade and a half of smells, rats, and worse, the area residents shot that idea down. Of course, as it often happens in many of these stories, one of the biggest reasons Brickyards closed was the value of the land on which they operated. As Chicago grew, the land previously used for brickmaking became more valuable for other types of development. Residential and commercial expansion often took precedence over industrial uses. The Weckler Brick Company and the William Bach Brick Company in North Center were both absorbed under the Illinois Brick Company umbrella, and when those operations north of Riverside Park ended, that area became open for redevelopment. Groundbreaking for a new building on that site took place on June 24, 1930, and construction was eventually completed despite delays caused by the Great Depression. Lane Tech High School officially opened and was dedicated at its current location on September 17, 1934. Oh, which reminds me, that stretch of roadway to the north of where Lane Tech is, originally called Warner Avenue that I mentioned earlier, was renamed Addison Street from Western Avenue to 6600 West in 1909 as part of the city's effort to standardize and clarify Chicago's street grid. On the other side of Addison, to the north, it was announced in 1923 that Mid-City Golf and Amusement Company would build an 18-hole golf course on the site of former Brickyards that would extend 2,000 feet on Western Avenue at Grace, roughly 3,800 north, and west to the north branch of the Chicago River with a 20-year lease. When the golf course shut down, it became a mixed-use area that includes the WGN TV studios. Other sites became green spaces, such as the area along the Chicago River to the north, where Kedzie meets Lincoln Avenue, now known as Stone Park. I mentioned William Gregg, who built his Excelsior Brick Company in what is now Westmont, Illinois. Unfortunately, even with his patented brick-making machines, mounting debt forced Gregg to mortgage off most of his company. After Gregg's brick factory shuttered in 1875 and Gregg moved away, his former home was repurposed. According to the Westmont Historical Society, Gregg's home was used as a farmhouse, restaurant, speakeasy, funeral home, and recreation center. Later, it was owned by Holy Trinity Catholic Parish, and it was occupied by a priest for a short time before becoming home to several nuns from 1939 to 1976. By the 1970s, the Gregg home had become dilapidated. After the Westmont Area Historical Society was formed in 1976 to save the building, it was moved a short distance and placed on a new foundation. It was added to the National Register of Historic Places in 1980. After restoration, it was opened as a museum in 1981 and is currently open for visitors 2 days a week. Just behind the Gregg House Museum is a baseball diamond, which reportedly is where the clay pit used by the Excelsior Brick Company was located. The name Westmont, by the way, showed up in newspapers in 1920 and was fully put into use with the village's incorporation on November 4th, 1921. One of the largest brickyards in Blue Island was the Wall Brothers Brickyard, which opened in 1886 on the west side of the Grand Trunk Tracks, south of 123rd Street. This facility, designed by the famed Chicago architectural firm Adler & Sullivan, was a massive industrial complex and major local employer. As brickmaking slowed by the mid-20th century, the Wall Brothers Brickyard closed and the site became a landfill. In 1994, the Meadows Golf Club of Blue Island opened on that site, where it continues to operate today. Just over the border in Munster, Indiana, the American Brick Company operated for decades, supplying bricks to the area, including Chicago, but also putting out a whole lot of fumes and pollution that Will mentioned earlier, filling the skies with so much grime drivers couldn't see in front of them. With the clay supply all but depleted, the brickyard closed down in 1965. 3 years later, Munster acquired the site to be used as the town dump, which was in use for nearly 40 years, finally ending operations in 2004. According to a 2022 Northwest Indiana Living piece, as early as 1975, the town had bigger plans for the area. They purchased adjacent land in 1992, and when the dump closed, they redeveloped the site into Centennial Park, Munster in 2007, which coincided with Munster's 100-year anniversary. Located on Calumet Avenue just south of 45th Street, the 200-acre Centennial Park offers a family-oriented environment with a playground, a 2,000-seat amphitheater, an entertainment stage, formal gardens, a 3-acre dog park, a 9-hole golf course, walking paths, fishing, and wide-open natural spaces. There are still a few signs of Chicago's brick-making past, that is, in addition to the thousands of buildings supported by Chicago Brick. Will Quam mentioned the Cary Brick Company. The Brickyard Mall at Diversey and Narragansett was once the site of the Cary Brick Company, which was organized in 1910 for the manufacture of common and sewer brick. With a capacity of 300,000 bricks per 8-hour day, the plant operated until the early 1960s, before the clay in the land was exhausted. Cary Brick downsized operations to a nearby building to focus on producing concrete bricks. One of the Cary Company's notable efforts in the early 1960s was furnishing 850,000 common bricks for the construction of the United of America Insurance Building, later known as the Unitron, then the Kemper Insurance Building, and now 1 East Wacker Drive, completed in 1962. At 41 stories and 522 feet in height, It ranked number 6 of the tallest buildings in Chicago for a short time. After the Cary Brick Company closed that site, it remained disused until it was redeveloped by landowner Robert Cary as Chicago's first ski slope to operate within city limits. Called Thunder Mountain, the site featured 55 skiable acres and a 280-foot slope built on a clay mountain, divided into 3 different runs for beginners, intermediates, and experts, all utilizing tow ropes. With its man-made hill and the basin of the former clay pit, it was said to offer the highest vertical drop of any ski hill within 200 miles. There were plans for a 5-story chalet on the Diversey side of the property, toboggan runs, an enclosed swimming pool, chairlifts, and a 125-unit motel. The owners had even discussed buying the gondola ride from the recently closed Riverview Park in Chicago and installing it on the top of the mountain. The first season at Thunder Mountain did not go well. Even with 12 to 15 snow guns creating machine-made snow, there was not enough natural snow due to a mild winter. By March of 1968, even though Thunder Mountain was only in operation a few days that season, the owners were still bullish about the future. Unfortunately, the lack of attendance and cost in running the business made this a one-season operation, never to reopen after that first season. The 117-store Brickyard Mall opened on the site in March of 1977. An enclosed 3-story building, the mall was beset with problems from early on involving traffic and eventually crime. That structure was later demolished in 2003 to make room for the Brickyards Shopping Center, a collection of big box stores such as Target and Home Depot. Oh, and before I forget, I should mention St. Stanislaus Kostka Church, built in 1881 in Pulaski Park, was built entirely of Chicago common brick, even on the facade, to save on construction costs. St. Andrew Lutheran Church, located on the northwest corner of West 37th Street and South Honore Street in the McKinley Park neighborhood of Chicago, which began construction in 1891, was also built using only common brick. Of course, once you can't get a hold of something easily, it becomes that much more attractive. This also happened with Chicago common bricks. According to Will Quam, when older brick buildings are taken down, there are brick recyclers waiting to gather up the Chicago common bricks to be used in new construction.
So Chicago common brick is not produced anymore and was once considered to be, the ugliest brick in the country. But that ugliness in today's world has made it one of the most desirable bricks in the country, because now a common brick, Chicago common brick, looks so much more rustic and real and true than any modern brick that you can get in a lot of people's eyes. So when a brick building is knocked down in Chicago, the bricks are saved, the common bricks are saved. It's huge piles, guys called stackers come in, and they work by hand, hammer in one hand, brick in the other hand, knocking off the mortar and palletizing these bricks, $540 per pallet. In 1998, they were paid $10 a pallet. Today, they're paid about $25 a pallet. It's hard work. It's cash work. From there, that brick gets taken by a reseller and then sold across the city, across the country, even more so. Some of it stays in Chicago. Things like the new Park District headquarters is made of reclaimed Chicago common brick. A lot of restaurants will use reclaimed brick on the interior to make it look older. One of the ways they make that possible and very economical is you actually take the full brick and then cut the 2 faces off of it. So now you have a tile, basically. And so they can just tile the inside of a restaurant that way. A lot of times when I go to restaurants with exposed interior walls, you look at the corners. That's usually where you can see the edge, and they don't go all the way. But the place that Chicago common brick is most desirable is the southern United States, the South, Louisiana, Texas, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi. I did a survey about a year ago on Realtor.com and found just shy of 200 homes for sale in the South advertising old Chicago brick as one of their selling features. I found one that listed lakefront property as the only thing in front of Chicago brick as a selling point. And these are not small homes. These are most of the time really large, luxurious homes. $2.5 million house in Louisiana where the whole first floor is paved in Chicago common brick. A mansion where the ceiling in the bedroom is vaulted with Chicago common brick. Corpus Christi, Texas, a gated community right by the ocean where every home of almost 24 homes is clad in reclaimed Chicago common brick. It's everywhere and it's so desirable and it's quite expensive now if you want it.
And because Chicago, there have been instances of unscrupulous brick reclaimers operating around the city, something that 83-year-old widow Maddie Miller discovered in 1980 when she was told someone had stolen the 2-story brick building she owned at 2603 West Lake Street. Wait, Tommy Henry, did you just say someone stole her 2-story brick building? I did indeed. Called brick pickers, thieves would literally demolish a disused building, pile up the worthwhile Chicago common bricks, and escape into the night, all without the owner's knowledge. City officials in 1984 calculated that a typical 2-flat had around 30,000 common bricks, and after demolition, approximately half would be salvageable. For this effort, a scavenger might make $1,500, slightly more than $4,600 in 2025 value. Now, these crimes were not without risk. One 42-year-old brick scavenger attempting to illegally remove bricks from a West Side building was crushed when a wall collapsed on top of him. As for Maddie Miller's property on Lake Street, although the 5-man team of brick pickers was eventually caught, her building had been destroyed. If you're out looking at buildings in Chicago, here's an easy way to spot a wall made of reclaimed Chicago common bricks. Original walls of Chicago brick from the same batch of clay should appear to have a uniform color. On a wall of reclaimed common bricks with ones taken from multiple sources, you'll see a large variation in colors, patina, staining, and even painting. For example, a painted Chicago brick next to a pink brick, next to a black one, next to a yellow or soot-stained common brick. Now, if you want to know more about bricks and architecture in the area, as they say in Chicago, I got a guy.
If you're interested in more, I lead tours all across the city of Chicago, 10 different neighborhoods. As far north as Rogers Park, as far south as Beverly, everywhere in between from McKinley Park to Old Town to Albany Park. It's all through my organization called Brick of Chicago. That's online at brickofchicago.com. I'm on Instagram at Brick of Chicago as well. And they all start from a place of brick, but they spiral out into neighborhood history and historical gossip and all these little things that surround us every day that if you just start to dig a little deeper, you can find so much cool stuff. I also have a book coming out about this time next year. It's through the University of Chicago Press. It's titled Fire and Clay, How Brick Reveals the Hidden History of Chicago. And it covers the history of brick architecture and brick making in Chicago from 1833 until today.
Thanks for listening to today's episode about the rise and fall of Chicago's Brickyards. This episode was written, recorded, and edited by me, Tommy Henry. Special thanks to resident brick expert and all-around good guy, Will Quam. For more about Will and his fantastic tours, go to brickofchicago.com. I have a brief list of links to books as well as other related items in the show's notes, as well as on the Chicago History Podcast website at chicagohistorypod.com. If you or someone you know is a history nerd like me who would like to learn more, anything ordered through those links, not just the items listed, may earn a small commission for the podcast and help offset production costs at no additional cost to you. If you don't already, please follow the show on social media as I update the usual sites throughout the week with articles, pictures, and behind-the-scenes tidbits to enhance the episodes. As always, if you have any questions about anything covered today, anything to add, or have an idea for a future episode, I'd love to hear about it. Send me an email at chicagohistorypod@gmail.com. The original art for the Chicago History Podcast used on the social media pages was created by John K. Schneider. So cool, Johnny. If you need creative work done, send him an email at angeleyesartjks@gmail.com. We'll be back soon with more stories from Chicago's history. Until then, get out and explore when possible. Learn more about whatever city you live in, and stay safe.